screen. Hopefully everyone can see that.
Yes, it's wonderful.
Thank you. So thank you again, everyone, for attending. This has been really wonderful so far. I'm going to follow on from the last talk by thinking about social and political dimensions of human-environment interactions. And I don't work in Anatolia. I work on Cyprus, and I'm going to be giving some examples of work that I think is really exciting and pushing us to think about the complexities of how humans engage with their surroundings. So Anatolia, places like Turkey and the Mediterranean are really, on the one hand, great for this, and on the other, quite complicated because of really long histories of human occupation. The Mediterranean has been called an utterly anthropogenic landscape. So disentangling some of the ways that landscapes and environments have been impacted by human behavior or shaped by natural forces tends to be what many scholars focus on. And because of the long occupations of history, we sometimes see assumptions that the environments of maybe 2,000, 4,000 years ago were roughly similar to what we're dealing with today. However, a lot of recent work is showing the variability in local, regional, climatic, ecological, environmental conditions. And this is spurring a lot of interest in the last decade or so in stitching together kinds of evidence to understand what these changes would have looked like on the ground. And here I'm just showing you one example of some pollen analyses from the Peloponnese in Greece. So you can see in the chart, you know, some places have a lot more records than others, but we're seeing variability over time. And there are a lot of challenges to trying to do this, to basically bring archaeological or historical, paleoclimatic evidence from natural archives together. I've just listed a few of them here. I'm not going to go into them, but it makes it really difficult. And many archaeologists and paleoclimatologists have been interested in understanding what the relationships are between various kinds of agency in the landscape. Scale can make this difficult. So using different kinds of proxies between survey sherds, lake sediment cores, Greenland ice cores to try to understand changes over time. And there are methodological choices with each of these techniques that introduce error or introduce blurriness between different categories of evidence. So it makes it really hard to tell a story. One issue here is regional resolution. So we still don't have a lot of archives from certain places. So where I work, for example, on Cyprus, we still lack a lot of paleoclimatic archives. Another is chronological resolution. Even when we have really great radiocarbon dates, we're often talking about environmental and social changes that are happening at century-long scales. And this makes it difficult, again, to understand what's happening on the ground, how humans are interacting with shifting environments. Another issue is causality. Again, how do we understand what the sort of forcing is of particular changes that we're seeing? And is that even the right question to be asking? And then another is kind of pitting humans against the environment, separating them out as if they are two different kinds of protagonists in a story. One of the most common problems that we see is correlation. So comparing paleoclimatic or paleo-environmental records with archaeological records can often give you graphs like this, where particular peaks or troughs in a record are associated with historical events. And this has been called the suck-in and smear effect because the chronological or the regional resolution is so poor that we're seeing what we want to see, which is that climate shapes human history, or humans are resilient in the face of major environmental catastrophes or disasters. One of the things that's been really helpful for archaeologists to start thinking about is the human experience of changing environments. And we heard a little bit about this already in the previous two talks. I really like this quote by Mike Hume, who's a climatologist and also geographer, who tries to get us to understand differences in the ways that humans think about weather, environments, and climate. So we, as moderns, tend to think of climate as an aggregate of weather, right? It's a 30-day average of precipitation or temperature in a place. But it's also, as he suggests, a way that we just familiarize ourselves with our surroundings. So I'm showing you two examples of pictures of Chicago, where I live. And on the same day, it could have snow, and then in the afternoon, all the snow has melted. And so climate is a way that we make sense of our surroundings. So we say, oh, well, it's April, you know, it's still likely to snow in Chicago. And this has been helpful for thinking about the social and political dimensions of human environment relationships. And this is, I think, something that archaeologists can contribute a lot to in the way that we study the history of human engagement with the world around them. So one is lived experience. How do people engage with their surroundings? They do this through perceiving things that change, through seasonal shifts, through agricultural tasks. And we should try as best we can, even if we don't necessarily have discursive texts, to think about experiences changing in a given place over time. Interactions can also look different depending on the social group under analysis or the society under analysis. So there's been a lot of really interesting work looking at the ways that non-elites or elites might have responded to the same kinds of environmental change, something like aridification or drought. People at the top of society might not suffer or might not experience the same kinds of limitations of drought as those that have to farm for self-sufficiency. Reactions to climate. So some people call this coping with climate change, or adaptations, mitigations to something like environmental change are not a given. So societies don't react the same way. And even subgroups or social groups, communities within a society don't react or interact or respond in the same way. And change might look very different depending on the context, the historical, the spatial context, and especially the political context. What I wanted to do for the rest of this talk is really just give you examples of some of the work that I've been drawing inspiration from to ask these kinds of questions. And there are a number of different approaches that really help us try to get at some of these social and political dimensions. Niche construction, the idea that humans, you know, create the conditions through daily or economic practices, political practices in the landscapes around them. You know, repeated forestry will actually create a new microecological context in which humans live. We've heard about resilience already today. This is another idea of thinking about archaeological ideas of sustainability. What does it look like to measure something like impacts on a landscape? Taskscapes have also been productive for thinking about the daily rhythms of something like agriculture or herding or quarrying or woodcutting that create landscapes, so human interactions with the world around them. And then also weathering, so how people come to construct new senses of climate or landscape. Maybe they shift habitats, or maybe they create new discursive records of the way that they're thinking about the world around them. And a lot of this is trying to understand political ecology. So the idea that landscapes are historically contingent relations that include people, things, and environments. And this is, in Mediterranean archaeology in particular, landscape is a really rich semantic concept, but there are approaches that tend to eschew environmental data. And I think what's important for us to remember is that landscapes also include things like plants, trees, soils, water sources. So how are people engaging with them? And in different ways. And so the flip to this question is, how do those practices reproduce society? So do certain landscape practices actually create something like social difference or inequality? What I wanted to do, again, is just highlight some of the work that I've been finding really inspiring for thinking or asking some of these questions. And many of you might be familiar with the work happening at Gordion by people like Mac Marston. I think Janan is maybe here at this workshop, but through archaeobotanical research at places like Gordian, and specifically long-term studies, so looking diachronically from the late Bronze Age to the medieval period, at all different kinds of proxies for human interactions, investments in, and impacts on the landscape. So ideas of niche construction, as well as sustainability. And so in the chart, I'm showing you a study that they did looking at basically the ratio of steppe vegetation to think about healthy steppe versus overgrazing between periods. So what does it look like when herding under empire takes a particular form that actually degrades the landscape and the steppe vegetation? This might not have been the primary purpose of herding, obviously, but it's having a direct impact on the landscape around it. We also see in this research interesting ideas about divergences in sustainable or unsustainable practices based on the people doing them and their position within society. So those behind the state might have particular incentives versus those who are probably more autonomous, small scale, independent farmers or agriculturalists. We can also think about, again, the way that ecological change, environmental change can spur its own kinds of political problems. So in a recent book by Catherine Blouin on the deltaic landscapes of the Nile, she looked at archaeological evidence, geomorphological evidence, so the hydrology of the Nile Delta, as well as papyrological evidence for the early Roman or the Roman imperial period, the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, in the Mendesian branch around the ancient city of Thmuis. And what it seems to be happening is long-term socio-environmental dynamics, something like the silting up of one branch of the Nile, combined with or entangled with certain imperial fiscal policies, so taxation on agricultural products, creating something like rural revolts in these marginal wetland areas where you have communities of farmers, but also fishermen, animal husbandry, and it's actually creating political problems because of not just ecological change or not just top-down economic policy, but the combination of those two. And this is where it just gets really complex to try to understand the contours of those processes. We can also look at adaptive strategies. So again, long-term studies. This is coming out of the Po Valley, work by Angela Trentacoste on zooarchaeological materials, so thinking about livestock, changes in livestock, and what she sees is an improvement in certain practices. So not only increased scale of production, but larger sizes of animals. And there's differentiation between urban centers or rural villages or sanctuaries. There's also high degrees of regionality. So even in places that might have similar ecosystemic properties, we're seeing different decision-making strategies happening on the ground. And again, that gets at these more difficult questions of social, political, economic dimensions. Other recent work has used zooarchaeological analyses to think about lived experiences, so food consumption, diets, foodways. This is a study, again, long-term diachronic study looking at the Bronze Age and Iron Age of Greece and Crete, which covers a transition right around 1200 BC, where it appears, at least in the Mediterranean, that things get much more arid. There's less precipitation, probably less water availability, as well as reduced market connections with trade. And what this is showing is heterogeneous relationships between what we would expect, rainfall and animal husbandry, so how they could be the most sustainable, and also the implications that that would have for decentralized social systems at the time. Similarly, we can look at proxies like storage or consumption to ask questions about the social, cultural, political dimensions of something like environmental change happening at the level of olive oil and wine production, which in the Mediterranean, particularly in the Bronze and Iron Ages, were starting to accrue real social value. So this is work by Catherine Pratt, looking at the cultural economy of something like olive oil and wine. And here what's important is that weather has an effect on olive cultivation, wine cultivation, and those changes would have been implicated in the ways that people were securing access to good land or to orchards, protecting claims to property over olive orchards and arboriculture. And so we can start to think about some of the potential political economic advantages of securing your claims to something like long-lived, enduring olive orchards. And then just really quickly to show you some of the work that I've been doing, this is a site called Kalavasos Vunaratashi in South Central Cyprus. This is roughly the Archaic period, so the 8th to 5th centuries BCE. Based on some of my own work, this seems to be a period of wetter conditions. So we're seeing probably more water availability in seasonal streams as well as springs. And this site happens to sit in a really interesting geomorphological area. It sits right at the interface of gypsum and limestone soils, right on the edge of an alluvial stream. And what we can see at the site based on survey and an excavation of a small rural house is mixed agropastoral and quarrying tasks on an unstable landscape. And so what I've been trying to understand is, why was the site abandoned? And it seems like something like the sustainable agropastoral and potentially even gypsum quarrying practices had kind of spun out of control. Climate change had created the conditions in which the settlement was no longer productive or favorable to what the household was doing. So let me just end by gesturing towards what we can say. I mean, this workshop, I think, did a really great job of asking about environmental challenges. And of course, there's a lot of ways that we can think about archaeological evidence as heuristically helpful for asking questions about human-environment relationships today, in the Mediterranean and elsewhere. And I think a kind of important question is just to think about the stories we're trying to tell. Whose stories, what sections of society, and I think archaeological evidence and archaeological stories are helpful for fracturing those ideas that societies respond to climate change in a particular way. Archaeologists are also really great at thinking over the long term, and many of the examples I showed you attest to the importance of diachronic studies. So thinking about change over time is going to be really helpful for modern climate models, as well as more creatively thinking about windows of sustainability. So thank you. Let me end there.